Welcome back to another episode of the Success Catalyst podcast, where I invite successful entrepreneurs and business owners to share their experience and tips that will help you build your dream episode by episode. I'm your host, Nina Robert, and today we have an episode lined up that you don't want to miss. I'm happy to have as my guest today, Jeremy Stockdale, the founder and CEO of Y Lead, specialized in leadership consultancy. He is a leading voice in gender equity, inclusive leadership, and he supports and challenges leaders to find their purpose and create a better environment for their teams. Jeremy, it's a real pleasure to have you here. So tell us more about what you do.
Well, thank you, Nina. Good morning, and thank you for that very lovely and generous introduction. It was a pleasure to be on your podcast. My background is got nothing to do with sort of leadership, really. I spent my background is I worked for a bank for 27 years, so that was my first career. And if I'm really honest, I was never that fascinated by banking. It was just sort of moving money around, isn't it, really? But what did fascinate me was when I became a leader about midway through my career. And for the first 18 months, 2 years, I wasn't particularly good at it. But as I started to improve and have more of an impact, I just found it so rewarding. I thought it was a real privilege to lead people. And I loved, seeing the impact I could have when I got it right. So I just embraced the privilege and responsibility of leadership. And that's what I did for the last 12 years of my career in Barclays, was the company. And when I left in 2019, I set up Y Lead because I wanted to help other leaders lead with a sense of purpose and humanity and compassion. I mean, I was lucky that I found purpose in my leadership, but we often tell people what leadership is. We might teach them aspects of how to do it, but very few leaders, I think, understand why they lead. I mean, I was an accidental manager, that I was kind of, got to a level of seniority where they gave me people. But I learned to kind of embrace my purpose as a leader, and that helped to make me an effective one, I believe. And so, I set up Y Lead because I want to help other leaders lead with that sense of purpose and humanity.
Well, that's amazing. It totally makes sense because being in a leadership position does not make you a leader or does not make you want to lead. You end up being promoted to a leadership position and you don't know what to do with that leadership role and responsibility, and especially that you have followers, you have a team of people who are depending on you, on your vision. So I guess if you don't have a clear vision for the business, for the team, it's not obvious to lead people anywhere if you don't know where to lead them. Am I right?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think I feel for leaders, because it's not that leaders are bad people. We have a huge problem with poor leadership around the world. I mean, don't even get me started on governments, but in workplaces generally, the standard of leadership is really poor, and I think in many cases getting worse. You've only got to look at sort of well-being stats and how people feel about leadership at work to see that. But it's not because leaders are bad people; it's because they're just not taught how to lead. People get to positions of leadership because they have great technical skills. But the skills you need to lead are completely different. There's a whole new set of skills that requires way more EQ than it does IQ. And yet organizations still massively over-index on the importance of IQ. And it's really not a massive differentiator. It doesn't make a huge amount of difference to how you lead. I always, I saw this, I listened to this once on an audio tape. So it shows what a long time ago it was. But it was a leader talking about what separates good leaders from great leaders. And what they said was that great leaders have three things. They have head, heart, and guts. And head means you've got intellect, you've got IQ. You need to have a certain amount of intellectual capacity to deal with all the data, all the information you need to have as a leader. But it's not a massive differentiator. Most people are smart enough to lead. What does turn someone from a manager into a leader is heart. So you've got decency, you've got compassion, you know what your values are, you can communicate those to others, you can connect with people, you care. But even that doesn't make necessarily a great leader. It's the kind of leader I'd like to follow, but a great leader is someone that combines head, heart, with the guts, and that means the courage to stand up for what you believe in. It means taking a stand on behalf of your people, even at personal cost. It means, being the one that kind of points out the flaw in something where no one else is seeing it or no one else is willing to say it. And that's what great leadership takes. We just don't teach people those kind of things. In fact, people almost learn the opposite. They learn the importance of protecting themselves and keeping themselves safe. And that very often has a negative impact on their people. So we fundamentally need to change the way we think about and teach leadership to people. And it's not just saying on a few courses about how to communicate or how to do disciplinaries. It's way, way deeper than that. It's about human connection.
I can remember a few leaders I came across when I used to work in the corporate world. And some of them were amazing. I learned so much, but some of them I learned so much from them just by doing the opposite of what they were doing.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, I was lucky. I mean, I think there are lots of people who go through their careers and they never really get to see what good looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And so they become a leader themselves. They learn all the bad habits and it just continues. I was really lucky in my career. I worked with some exceptional leaders, people that I would literally, follow over the trenches into no man's land if they asked me to, men and women. So it was definitely not a gender thing. I really had some great leaders, but I also had some absolute shockers. And in fact, in my penultimate year at the bank, I worked for a dreadful leader, a really, really senior individual, but a dreadful leader. And that was one of my moments when I thought, I'm probably done here. Because when after 25 years, you can go from having an amazing leader, which I had in 2017, to a dreadful leader in 2018, without fundamentally changing your role or who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And the impact it had was just like night and day. And so, but you're right. What I've learned is a few leaders I can think of where I've learned never do that. Never behave in that way. And that helped me almost as much as observing and emulating the great things that my really good leaders did.
Well, that makes total sense. So I guess he ended up leading you outside of that environment.
Well, I think to be fair, I eventually told him how I felt, and it led to some very mature conversations, which made us realize we needed to part ways. And then I was actually rescued by another brilliant leader I'd worked with previously. He brought me across to work with him on a secondment. And that led to me having the choice about whether to stay there or to leave. And much as I was loving working in a good environment again, I just thought 27 years, I'm done. I can do more out in the world now than I can in one organization. And I left very grateful and knowing I'd learned a huge amount, but definitely that I could have more of an impact on the world outside of the corporate environment. So it worked out very well for me. But you're right, actually, if it doesn't traumatize you too much, then you can learn some amazing things from poor leaders, mostly what not to do.
Absolutely. Let me ask you this. I know every success comes with a challenge, usually, be it for the business or for the person on a personal level, that would push us to get outside of that comfort zone. Have you faced such a challenge or such an event for you or for your business?
There's been so many, because I think that, I spent, let's say 27 years in the corporate world. I left in 2019, had 6 months off. And then I did some consultancy work before the pandemic, which was great. It was nice being working again, and I learned a lot from doing so. But then when the pandemic happened, I decided to kind of go it alone, design my own business. And after about 6 months of learning and talking to people and trying to work out what I was going to do, I remember just waking up and thinking to myself, I just don't know what I'm doing. I just don't know what I'm doing. And I spoke to a friend of mine, and she said to me, well, have you ever been the CEO of a startup before? And I said, well, no, I haven't. It's like, well, there you go then. And he said, what that means is that, you're learning something new, you're growing. So embrace that. Go and talk to other CEOs of startups that have perhaps been there a bit longer than you and find out how they're getting on. She put me in contact with a couple of people. And I think what I've realized through my career is the amount of times I've experienced imposter syndrome been huge. I mean, I can think of many, many times I've really genuinely thought, I just cannot do this. I'm out of my depth. I'm going to get found out, and I'll be tapped on the shoulder and said, okay, listen, we now realize you're not up for this. And yet somehow, every time I've got through it, And what happened in the latter part of my career is that I remember I went to run an overseas business in 2013, and after the first 6 months, I'd drive in every single day thinking, I just can't do this. I mean, I'm so out my depth. It's such a mess. But I remember thinking that you've been there before, and so the old phrase, "This too will pass." I just thought, you just got to reframe that. And so that's kind of what I've done a number of times through starting up my own business. It's all been a massive learning journey. I've learned so many things that I've never known before. And I remember it is about 2022 in about March time, I suddenly had this sort of thought that I'm sort of growing into the role of being a CEO of a startup. I start to feel more confident with the uncertainty and thought, well, I've now got some clients, I'm doing some things. But it had taken nearly 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the things that if you really want to do something, it will take time. It will take time to learn, and you'll have to overcome the imposter syndrome, the barriers. And I remember seeing a lovely way of reframing imposter syndrome. It was Stephen Bartlett that said it. And if you're experiencing imposter syndrome, what that actually means is that you're doing something new, you're doing something that is unfamiliar. And so you're growing. So you're actually in a growth zone.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, it feels a bit uncertain. Yes, it feels a bit uncomfortable. What that means is you're going through growth, and you'll come out the other side having learned something new and being better and stronger. And I thought, what a beautiful way of thinking about it. Because imposter syndrome is very often pathologized, isn't it? And it's
Yes.
very often something that's like, women, you have imposter syndrome. Let's help you with that. It's like, no, if you're experiencing that, you're just growing. You're in a growth zone. That's a good thing. So yeah, there's been many things I've had to challenge of experience and still do in my business. But after 4 years now of running it, I just feel that I've got all those 4 years of experience and know-how now that is serving me well. It just takes time. We can very often be too impatient, can't we?
Yeah. I guess imposter syndrome comes whenever we step outside the comfort zone because it's an unknown environment and we end up thinking, am I in the right place? Am I doing the right thing? Do
Yeah.
I actually know what I'm doing? Like the question you asked yourself. So it totally makes sense, but it shouldn't be pathologized at all. It should be a way for us to understand that this is a whole new level of awareness that's coming to unveil and to discover. From our point of view is changing. The comfort zone is now right behind us. There's so much to learn, but we have to enjoy the process. We have to let ourselves
Yeah.
grow into this new environment that eventually will transform into a new comfort zone, and we have to outgrow it eventually.
I mean,
Um,
I'd love to get your thoughts, Millie, because you've gone from being a mechanical engineering by background. Is that right? Is it your
uh,
engineering background?
Telecommunication, actually, but yeah,
Telecommunications.
nothing to do with leadership or coaching
Yeah.
whatsoever.
And now
And
you're doing what you're doing. So
yeah,
you must have experienced very similar things as you've gone through that. I mean, what were some
absolutely,
of the
I
challenges
did.
you've had?
Yeah, I ended up, so I started as an IT engineer, telecommunication engineer, and then I ended up becoming a project manager, and then a manager, and then a team lead. And eventually I find myself leading people and didn't know what was I doing exactly.
Yeah.
I had no idea how to lead people, what a leadership position responsibilities are, or things like that. What are the main challenges that my team are going to be facing, and how can I deal with them on a daily basis, all with going towards this goal that we set up as a team. So yeah, I learned in the process, and I learned within this idea of this new comfort zone. I learned to let myself grow and learn from my mistakes, learn from other leaders what to do or what not to do. And yeah, eventually I loved it. I loved coaching people. I loved giving people more a sense of purpose. I loved explaining my vision, and I loved getting people engaged with my vision. So that led me to what I'm doing now. Now I'm helping other entrepreneurs and business owners becoming a better person, a better version of themselves, reaching out their goals, and eventually to reach a better and bigger goal, you have to have people following you and helping you. So leadership is a part of the game.
Yeah, and I
One of
guess having been through that experience yourself, it means that you're well equipped to know the narrative and the journey that people have to go through to kind of create those.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah,
changes. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. I always say that I'm the product of my product because I've been there and
Yeah.
I'm the proof that this works. I ended up here. So
Yes.
it must be true. It must be working. One of the main topics that you talk about on social media is gender equity.
Yeah.
How well do you think that business owners nowadays understand and apply this?
Yeah. And it's a great question because I think that my answer is I don't think they do understand it at all well. And I think they therefore make mistakes in how they apply it. What I see with a lot of kind of, diversity, equity, and inclusion type work is it's very tokenistic. It's very reactive to either legislation or events like International Women's Day, well, let's do something.
Yeah.
Whereas it's not understood enough. It's not systemic enough. And I say that with no judgment because I was exactly the same. But for the first 51 years of my life, I genuinely thought I was one of the good guys who understood this stuff. I thought I understood some of the barriers that women face. I, did quite a lot to sponsor and mentor women through my career. I had a good gender balance in my team once I understood that better. But I realized about 3 years ago that I just didn't have a clue. I didn't do enough because I didn't know enough. And that's so awareness is the starting point for everyone. And what changed things for me was a very simple, very tragic thing, which is when there's a woman called Sarah Everard that was she was abducted, raped, and murdered, and it turned out the perpetrator was a serving police officer. So massive outcry across the UK, and what really struck me, apart from the tragedy of the event itself, was just the outpouring from women, especially in the UK, but around the world, really saying, well, we're never safe. We're never safe. And I spoke to someone and said, what can I do to be a better male ally? And she said, read 2 books. And the 2 books were Everyday Sexism by Laura Bates and Invisible Women by Caroline Criado Perez. Now, for anyone that hasn't read them, I strongly recommend them. I knew sexism existed, and I know there are data biases that favor men in the way things are designed, but I had no idea of the scale. No idea of the scale of the way that women and girls have to adjust the way they show up in life just to keep themselves safe. And even in the areas where you wouldn't expect you need to be safe, like at school, in the workplace. And reading those 2 books, it opened my eyes massively. It made me want to learn more. So I've read loads more books. I've spoken to hundreds of women. And now I think I'm more aware of the issues. I acknowledge that that is the reality. And as a result, I'm now taking action to do something about it. But I think most organizations don't understand those things.
Mm-hmm.
So the more we can do to educate men and women about the realities that are faced from a gender perspective, the more chance there is of making progress.
I love that. Yeah, it's never enough to talk about sexism in the workplace or in general in everyday life. So what are some practical tips that you could give our listeners to build an environment where gender equity is respected in a business?
Yeah. Well, I think what I would be saying, if I was talking to an organization, as I often do, about what they need to do, the first thing I'd say is you have to have a long-term vision.
Mm-hmm.
Organizations very typically, and this is certainly one of my frustrations with the organization I worked for when I left, they overestimate what could be done in the short term, but underestimate to an even greater degree what could be achieved in the long term. So when it comes to something like gender equity, when you're dealing with not just, you're dealing with centuries of oppression and learned behaviors and societal ways of operating, you're not going to change it by running a few workshops. So what I would say to organizations is have a long-term vision. Decide a point in the future. It may only be 3 years, but it could be 5 years, and say, this is what we want it to be like in our organization. This is how we want it to feel. This is what we want it to be like for people in a way that they can show up and be themselves, where we can create equity. So then from that, you then set a few goals and a few metrics you want to achieve. You have to make sure that from the top of the organization down, they're authentically supporting this. And in order to do that, they have to be educated themselves. It's not enough for the senior leadership groups to throw some budget at it and stand up and be performative and say, I'm really behind all of this, but not do the work themselves. So you have to do the education. I think making people aware of the realities faced by women and men in the workplace and society is critically important. I mean, for years and years, female talent program has been run in organizations. You probably experienced a few of them yourself, and I was heavily involved in them in my time at Barclays. The problem with them is that there wasn't a single woman I know came off those programs who didn't come away feeling more confident, more self-assured, self-aware, thinking that I'm now ready to take on the world. But we throw them back into the same old environment that doesn't get the best out of them. So what they then do is they either kind of suck it up or they leave. Very often, I saw talented women leave after those programs. So there is a place for those, but what really needs to change is the environment. You need to do some work to change the environment that people experience. And the other thing I think we ought to be doing, as well as developing women, is helping men to show up in a more authentic and more vulnerable way. From the age of 6, boys are taught that the only real emotion that is valid for them to share is anger. And then that carries on right through the rest of their lives. That's really hard to unlearn, that kind of behavior. So it makes it hard for men to be vulnerable and compassionate and intuitive when it comes to leadership roles. But those are shown to be far more effective indicators of good leadership than some of the more typically masculine traits that are rewarded and recognized. So it really is a long-term commitment you have to have as an organization, but it starts with becoming aware of the issues that exist and then starting to acknowledge them and take action towards them.
Now, you've been working with businesses for a long time, and I'm sure you've seen lots of mistakes that leaders make, either in this topic, gender equity, or in other areas of business leadership in general. So what do you think is the main mistake that a leader would end up making?
But when it comes to gender equity, or just generally as a leader?
Let's say in general.
I think that it comes back to, again, because I don't think it's just the leader themselves. I think it's the environment they're in. When you become a leader, you're expected to be able to lead from day one, typically, which is really, really unfair. It's just not realistic. So almost I'd rather turn it around and say, so don't. So the mistake to avoid is to assume that you can lead from day one. You may have picked up some few good tips from leaders you've seen before. You may have picked up some things that you've seen from leaders that you don't want to emulate because of the impact they had on you and others. So you'll have a baseline of understanding, but to see leadership as a journey you're going to be going on, and invest your time in working out what is your purpose as a leader. What is it about you that should make people want to follow you? And then develop and learn that. Read books. Find yourself a mentor. Find yourself people who you can emulate that have good traits. Get feedback from the people you're leading, and you don't have to ask them. Just observe. Be self-aware enough to observe. Did that work or did that not work? Did that have the impact I wanted? I think that if leaders can really sort of embrace the fact they're going on a learning journey that will never end, to me, that's quite liberating. But what it also does, it puts you in control. And one of the toughest things I found about being a leader is not feeling in control, either of my environment or of my people or my performance. Once I realized that everything that happens is down to me and I can influence everything either directly or indirectly, that was a really liberating feeling because I realized that I had control over it. It didn't mean I would necessarily be able to fix it quickly, but over time, by doing the right things, I could. I mean, a good example is I used to get really frustrated with my communications not landing the way I wanted. And I'd get frustrated that people didn't understand me or didn't do what I expected. And when I realized that actually, if ever a communication hasn't landed the way I wanted, that's on me, not them, it just put me in a position where I could self-reflect and think, okay, so what can I do differently? What didn't work? And I could seek then feedback. I could ask people honestly, but knowing that it wasn't a judgment on me, it was just getting feedback on what worked and what didn't. And then I could make adjustments, but it put me back in control of my leadership. So if you become a leader, if you start to get responsibility for people, even just one other person, then it's something you have to recognize the privilege it is and take up the long-term responsibility that goes with that. That's my advice to leaders, really, is to embrace the privilege of leadership.
That's very good advice. I wanted to add something about what you said about asking about feedback and being vulnerable. These are two things that most people in leadership positions do not do because they don't think they're allowed to, or they don't think they would seem credible or good leaders if they ask for feedback or if they show their vulnerability. I found out that the amount of help and support that you can get from your team, as well as the amount of respect that you can get from your team, is really huge when you show a little bit of vulnerability and say, I'm not sure if this is the right approach. Like, what do you guys think? Or is there any feedback that I can use to become a better leader for you, for the team, and to reach our goals better? What do you think I can help you with that I'm not providing so far? These are questions that do not actually reduce your leadership aura, let's say, or your credibility whatsoever, but it does bring you closer to your team members. It does show that you're only human, and it's much easier to work with humans than with a godlike leader that never makes any mistakes or never shows any vulnerability of any kind.
I think that's such a brilliant statement. I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think about the leader I mentioned in 2018 that didn't do the best for me or for others. They didn't seem to have any vulnerabilities at all. They really didn't. They weren't all bad. They had some good qualities, but they didn't seem to have any vulnerabilities. Back to when I was at first a leader of a large group of people, like I had various remote sites and about 150 people altogether that I was responsible for. And I said I wasn't very good for the first 18 months. One of the turning points was that I remember, because I came out of head office, I was quite young, full of confidence. And my initial impact was really good because I traded on confidence and charisma, as many men do. But then, of course, they could start to see through the cracks, the lack of substance beneath that. But rather than then recognize that how things are going, the front I put on was always, again, of this kind of confidence, even though increasingly I was feeling utterly kind of lacking in any self-esteem or confidence, knowing I wasn't having a good impact. But that's not what I portrayed. And one of the breakthroughs was, and it wasn't something I did consciously, it just happened, that I shared with my team after about a year, maybe 15 months, that I'd really struggled over the previous 12 months, that I didn't really know what I was doing. I recognise now all the mistakes I made. And I just said it's been incredibly tough for me. I can't tell you the impact that had on the people around me, because I just said, we had no idea you felt that way. We had no idea. And I'm not saying it was the only turning point. There are other factors as well. But I look back now and realise that first show of vulnerability, which kind of came quite organically, albeit after many, many years, made a real difference. Now, as I became more conscious of vulnerability and the importance of it, and the more I showed it, then exactly the things you said. What I realised, you almost had a double impact. When you show vulnerability and you ask people for advice, not only are you showing your vulnerability and getting something in return, but it makes that person feel really valued.
Yeah.
It makes them feel that their opinions, their expertise is valued and respected by you when you ask for that. So it has a double impact. It builds greater connections and mutual respect and trust. Even though it's been talked about massively by Brené Brown in all the great work she does, and people kind of throw it around like psychological safety, real vulnerability in leaders is still quite rare, and it's such an underutilized asset. As you say, people want to work for a human. I certainly do. But I think it's because we don't really teach leadership in a way it should be taught. If we started from that, there are certain agentic traits that you'll need. You need to be decisive. You need to be confident. You need to be logical and disciplined. It's just as if not more important to be vulnerable, to be compassionate, to be curious, to be generous, to be kind, to show you care. If we approach leadership from the outset saying this is what leadership entails, it's a combination of these traits, then I think more and more people will be able to go into it and be willing to learn as they go rather than think they have to default straight away to what typically happens. They just go for the agentic masculine traits.
I would add something else, that I think leadership is a long-term project. You cannot lead people just for a few months and then realize the project and you're done. You have to lead them for the long term, because there's a lot to learn from you as a leader. There's a lot to learn from the team, and there's a lot to grow into. That's this new environment that you're leading them to. Like, my vision is always that the leader has a goal for himself and for the team. So if the goal is big enough and worthy enough of you or your team, you're growing together. And this growth does not happen overnight. But I think most leaders tend to underestimate that. And as you said earlier, they underestimate the long-term returns of a good leadership.
Can I just build on that point, Nini? Because I think it's a brilliant one. Because what I've observed a lot, I think you're 100% right. It takes a long time to learn leadership competence. But what I also noticed a lot was that I saw a number of very, very competent leaders get into the point of competence when they could then lead, and they learned some traits and they could do some things. But what they then stopped doing is learning. They just thought, well, this is me now. This is what I do. And implicitly, all of their people have to adjust to what they do. And what I now realize is that you never can stop learning. You have to always keep investing in your skills and your knowledge, because people change, the context changes, the world is changing so rapidly. But so many leaders get stuck. They think, okay, I've found some things now. That's what I'll do forever. And it is a continuous learning journey.
Absolutely. Deciding on that would not lead you anywhere else. Like, you're gonna be stuck. Okay, you'll lead people to whatever knowledge or expertise you have, but you're not growing, you're not evolving, you're not reaching any more goals or stepping outside of your comfort zone anymore. I have another question for you, Jeremy. So I can't help but notice your t-shirt and the color of your nails. So what's the story behind?
Yes, well, I'll start with the t-shirt because that's the easy one. The elephant in the room is, of course, these. So the t-shirt came about because as I've been exploring gender equity through 2021 and 2022 and educating myself, and I was thinking more and more about the topic of allyship, how I could be a better male ally. My daughter, coincidentally, has a t-shirt that says, "On Wednesdays, we smash the patriarchy." And I eventually persuaded her to let me write a post about it. I've been periodically posting on LinkedIn. And so I wrote a post about her and did a little interview and had a picture of her wearing a t-shirt. And it got quite a good reception. So the following week, I wrote about the patriarchy again, how the patriarchy damages women. The week after, I then wrote about how it's damaging for men, because it had insidious impacts on men as well in terms of the way they show up in society. And it just kind of developed from there. So every single week now, for over a year, I've been writing a post that starts off with, "On Wednesdays, you smash the patriarchy." Then I'll talk about some aspect of gender equity. And it's been an incredible learning journey for me. I've learned so much from reading the comments from people. It's massively helped my own learning. I've met some amazing people through that. You and I had already connected previously, but I think it was the post that reconnected us and led to us having this conversation today. So it's been a wonderful thing. The nails, however, is one of the people that I met is a guy called Daniele Fiandaca, and he runs a company called Token Man Consulting. And he messaged me 2 or 3 weeks ago and said, "I want to do this beta test to see whether to get men," it's called Hard as Nails, men getting their nails painted, to see what reactions they get and how it makes them feel. And I was initially quite hesitant. I'm writing about this on Wednesday's post, so you can see that on Wednesday. But I just thought, I'm not sure this is me. And of course, a little bit of, will I be laughed at? How will it feel? What reactions I get? And in the end, I just thought I should just do it. Just do it. So last Wednesday, I had my nails painted. This is the first time I've ever had a manicure, never mind had my nails painted at the age of 54. And I'll be honest, I really like it. I think they look really pretty.
They look amazing.
And so I'm keeping them on for at least the rest of this week, because on Thursday, the men that had it done are going to come back and just discuss what reaction they've had, how they felt themselves. But I must admit, I feel much more comfortable with it than I thought I would do. Certainly, it doesn't detract in any way from my masculinity. But but I don't know, the reactions I've had have been really positive from people. It ranges from people saying nice nails to I couldn't help but noticing the nails. No, but it always leads then to a conversation about why I've done it and what it means and what it's supposed to represent. One of the things I've realized is that it'd almost be impossible to display toxic masculinity wearing nails like this.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. And I think it's a very good exercise to try something a little bit scary. Like
Yeah.
I have this routine like at least once a week. If I can, once every day, I would try something new that is a little bit scary. It doesn't have to be jumping off a cliff, but I need to make myself uncomfortable and get
Yes.
comfortable being uncomfortable.
Mm. I think
It's
it's a brilliant philosophy, and I think if I look back at my life and career, there's been many times when I've been quite conservative and played it safe.
Mhm.
Most of the best things that have ever happened to me are when I've taken a bit of a risk, and it's always come with some hardship at first. It's always come with uncertainty or fear or just deep discomfort or even unhappiness. But I've always come out the other side better for it, and it's a real lesson for me. Is just yeah, do stuff. It may not always work out, but yeah, it's not going to kill you getting your nails done. And actually, the result I've had from it has been nothing but positive. So that's just a small thing. Leaving a very safe 27-year corporate career to start my own business, I look back now with hindsight, I think that was quite a bold thing to do. But I mean, the life I'm leading now in terms of feeling I've got a real sense of purpose, that I can actually make a difference to the world, meeting wonderful people like yourself and others, it's joyful. And that wouldn't have happened if I'd stayed in my comfort zone. So it's almost one of the best bits of advice you can give anyone is, yeah, just take a few risks, back yourself.
Absolutely.
I think I love that idea of just doing something that makes you feel uncomfortable. So you get used to the feeling of being uncomfortable.
Yeah, so that you can do better things and bigger things because it definitely is very crucial to be uncomfortable, or otherwise you're still in the comfort zone. If you're not uncomfortable, you're still there.
Mm.
So how can we connect with you and find you to work with you? Do you have any online courses? Do you do in-person work? Tell us more.
So all the work I do is very bespoke. I don't believe in having standard work
Mhm.
that we kind of package. So the best way of connecting with me is by email. So jeremy@wiley.co.uk. I'm happy for people to WhatsApp me as well. My number's 07387 238242 +44 if you're outside the UK. But another good way is through LinkedIn because I've got now a reasonable LinkedIn following. I post every single Wednesday, periodically during the week as well. And so LinkedIn is a good source. If you want to find out more about me and what I do, that would be a good way of doing it.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeremy. And what is one last advice that you could give a business owner or an entrepreneur who's listening to us?
The best advice I'd give, because I'm living proof of it, is never stop learning. Just never stop learning. Be curious about the world. Be prepared to be vulnerable. Unlearn things that you've held dear for many years, and approach the world with curiosity and awe. It's just there's so much to learn, and it's fascinating.
Absolutely. I totally agree. That's one of the best advice, one of the best pieces of advice I've gotten so far. That got me very far because a few years ago I was in this comfort zone again that I thought I knew quite a lot and I could like have a decent living out of what I knew, out of my
Mm.
expertise, out of my role. I can get maybe a promotion every few years and that would be all. I did not really think of how important and crucial for me, for my business, for my mental health, for my physical health to keep learning every day. And the thing is, we don't know what we don't know. So always keep that in mind. That would be my advice, actually.
Yeah, it's
So
great advice.
absolutely. Thank you so much, Jeremy, for joining me today in the Success Catalyst episode. It's been a really great pleasure to have you. I learned so much, and thank you all to our listeners, and we'll see you again in the next episode.
Thank you, Nina.